Welcome to Moments with Marianne. This is your host, Marianne Pastana. And we're here today with special guest, Dr. MaryCatherine McDonald, who's here to share with us her new book, The Joy Reset: 6 Ways Trauma Steals Happiness and How to Win It Back. So what if the very reason joy feels so out of reach isn't because you're broken, but because your brain has been trying to protect you? Well, today's guest is going to share with us how to overcome just that. Dr. MaryCatherine McDonald is a trauma researcher, author, and coach who helps people reframe trauma as a strength response and reconnect with joy. She's passionate about making healing accessible, grounded, and even a little bit fun. So welcome to the show, Dr. MaryCatherine McDonald.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so thrilled to be here.
Oh my goodness, what an honor it is to have you here and to talk about this groundbreaking book. Can you share with us what inspired you to write this?
Yes. So I work primarily with folks who are dealing with some kind of trauma. And in 2020, as you know, all of our traumas amplified, right? So we had these huge global traumas going on, and then we had our everyday traumas that were also unfolding. And I found that even though I'm a specialist in trauma, that I felt very under-resourced when it came to helping folks just get oriented in their day-to-day life and not be super overwhelmed by everything that was going on. And so I reached for positive psychology, which is a field that focuses on, instead of kind of pathology, what about the parts of us that are about hope and joy and these positive emotions. And what I found was that there was a lot of incredibly intense and strong research that shows that if we can connect to things like joy and gratitude and hope, that these things actually have healing power. But there wasn't a lot of work on how to help someone who's dealing with a lot of trauma get to these emotions. If we think neurobiologically, what we see is that the emotions of fear and anxiety and trauma run counter to the emotions of joy and hope and gratitude. So when you're in one space, when you're on one circuit, you could call it the fear circuit and the hope circuit, the other one is by definition not available to you. And so if you're feeling a lot of trauma and overwhelm, you're not going to be able to reach for joy and gratitude and hope unless we can build a bridge. And so this book became, as many things do, it started out as like what I thought was going to be a quick project and turned into a 6-year project where I found that we could build a bridge from trauma to joy. And that one of the things that's really helpful here is to figure out what are the specific barriers that tend to stand in the way of someone experiencing joy. Because we label joy and hope as these positive emotions, we think, well, of course, why wouldn't I want to be able to lean into those when I'm dealing with stress or anxiety? So what's wrong with me if I can't reach them? And so I identify 6 different joy thieves that tend to get in the way of our experience of joy. And the great thing about that is that once we realize what the thieves are, we can figure out how to outsmart them at their own game. In general, the book does 2 things. It kind of redefines hope and joy as not just these positive, sort of fluffy, silly emotions that are a luxury, but that are actually neurobiological lifelines that help us through the darkest times. So they are things that we should reach for when we are going through our darkest hours. And then second, how do you actually do that when your nervous system has been wired for hypervigilance and anxiety? So that was the goal, and that's the project sort of in a nutshell.
Well, it's interesting because I think a lot of times when people hear about joy or hope, they think these are kind of fluffy emotions,
Yep.
and maybe joy can be kind of a reach. So, how can we get to this place where we can really lean into these emotions?
That's a great way to put that. I think that joy and hope, again, get sort of misdefined as these silly, fluffy things, and they feel very counter to the darkness. I also think we tell some incorrect stories. Like one of the ones we hear most commonly here in 2025 is don't give up hope. You can't give up hope. The truth is that joy and hope are the pillars of resilience, and they don't need you to believe in them for them to exist. They will find you in the darkness. So sometimes your only job is to hold on. So if you're in an acute trauma or stress or overwhelm, all you have to focus on is hold on and sort of open the window for the possibility of joy and hope to appear, and you will find it. The second thing is if you're wanting to reach for the practice of joy and hope and kind of bring them into your daily life as a regulation tool, I think the trick is in scaling way, way down. So we tend to think like, okay, if I've got something big and bad going on, then that means I need something equally big and good to counter it. And the truth is that joy is so powerful and is so powerful that bringing them in for 10 or 20 seconds a day can be something that will help you rewire your brain and your nervous system. So, the simplest practice that I have at hand is called Tiny Little Joys. And basically, all that it requires you to do is to think about your current environment or the last, say, 4 hours, and think about something that you can see or touch or something that happened that sparks the tiniest little feeling of joy. It doesn't have to be over the moon happiness, it's just this tiny little feeling of joy. So, to give you an example, on my desk, I have this tiny little snow globe that has a bunny in it that my friend brought to me from Paris. She went on a trip. And every time I look at it, I get this tiny little spark of joy. So if I can look at those things a couple of times during my day and find a spark of joy, I am rewiring my brain towards resilience and away from stress and anxiety because every second that we spend in the joy circuit, in the hope circuit, thinking about joys and imprinting them and feeling them is a second that our fear circuit is by definition offline.
I love how you bring that all together. One of the things in your book you talk about are joy thieves.
Mhm.
What are those and how can we identify them?
Okay, great question. So there's 6 of them and they're organized into 3 buckets. So the 3 buckets are joy resistance, joy fear, and then joy guilt. And I'll run through them and then give you a couple of examples that'll be very vivid. So the first is hypervigilance. When your nervous system is on alert for potential threat, feelings like joy or hope feel actually disruptive to the project at hand. So you'll push them away, you'll resist them. Emotional numbing is the second one. This happens when we have, unprocessed traumas from the past and that lead to these really overwhelming emotions like panic or intense sadness. So we numb those feelings as a way to protect us, but then we also end up numbing the joy or hope that we might feel for the future. Fear of loss is the third. This one is that, if you've had any loss in your life, which all of us have, you become acutely attuned to the fragility of happiness. And so you kind of wait for the other shoe to drop instead of leaning into the experience of joy or hope that you have. The fourth one is fear conditioning, which happens when you have something joyful that gets disrupted and your brain learns to connect joy with fear. Joy guilt is the bucket that has 2 related thieves, guilt and shame. So joy guilt happens when something awful happens or something awful is happening, and it tricks you into thinking that you are not entitled to the joy that you're feeling. And then shame is when you've been so sort of soaked in shame that you internalize the belief that you are unworthy of anything good, joy, or hope. So, just to give you 2 really quick examples, joy guilt, I think, is really operative right now in 2025 because there's so much darkness going on in the world that people think if anything good happens to them or is happening to them, that they're not entitled to feel it because they should feel guilty for having good things happen when bad things are happening. And then hypervigilance, I think, is very, very common. If you've ever had any overwhelm or trauma in your past, your nervous system adapts beautifully to that by putting you in this hypervigilant state where you're scanning for threat at all times. And it can be really hard to let in joy because joy is going to ask you to bring your guard down.
It's amazing how all of this impacts our brain. And when you were talking about emotional numbing, I'm sure there are many people that are listening right now that are saying to themselves, okay, I can identify with that. I've done that. I feel that right now.
And it's critical to know that those things, these are, I call them thieves, and we want to think about how to outsmart them, but it's also really important to understand that they're here for a reason. They're trying to protect us. It's just that they're protecting us in the wrong way or from the wrong thing. And so when we can recognize which of the joy thieves are operative, then we can deal with the thieves and then get to the joy. So if it comes to guilt, for example, guilt is designed to make us do something. It's if you feel guilty about something, one of the reasons that feeling exists is so that you do something to repair whatever it is you feel guilty for. And so instead of starving yourself of joy, if you feel guilty, you could redirect that guilt towards an action. What could you do for someone who you know is suffering that would make you feel like you've done something good and then also still imprint the joy that you have? When it comes to things like hypervigilance, the counter practice is tiny little joys, because in tiny little doses, tiny little joys help your nervous system see that joy is not actually dangerous.
So, do tiny little joys rewire our brain?
They do. So we have by nature an automatic negativity bias. This is just sort of an evolutionary advantage. If human beings remember and imprint the things that are dangerous, they're more likely to stay alive. So there's a really strong biological pull to the negative. That means that if we let that go, we end up having a pretty negative view of the world. And so, what something like Tiny Little Joys does is that it gives us an opportunity to manually imprint the good that is sitting there right alongside the bad. And it's not there to negate the bad, it's not there to cancel it out. But I think sometimes we miss that it exists because we are so steeped in the negative. So if you practice tiny little joys, you're giving your brain an opportunity to understand and see, and then start to automatically imprint the good things that are also happening. So you can start to actually kind of bump out that negativity bias, which gives you a more holistic view of the world and one that's more based in reality, frankly.
That's so impressive how these shifts can make such a difference, and it kind of dovetails with, because I know in your book you
Yeah.
talk about, you explain how meaning isn't something we find, but something we make. And I'd love for you to expand on that.
Yeah, I think this is something that I wish we could, if someone had told me this in fourth grade, I feel like the trajectory of my life would have been very different. That we are part of the human project is to live and grapple with uncertainty. And what that means is that we are tasked with this incredible thing of making meaning. We have so little control over so much of what happens to us, right? Much of the world is sort of happening and we can't control it or do anything about it. And that tends to leave us often in a state of despair. If I don't have control, then that means I can't do anything to change things. And that means, what's the point? And that can feel like the end of the story. What I think is really important to understand is that even though that is very scary, and I want to validate that, it's also a beginning, because we can make meaning of whatever happens to us, and we have to. And so we're tasked with that. But then that means that we also have freedom in these things, even things that feel really terrible, to decide what they're going to mean for us and the larger arc of our lives. And again, that doesn't take away the pain. If something awful happens to you, it's not like, okay, well, then tomorrow you just slap a meaning on it and then the pain goes away. No, the pain is there. And the meaning making work that you do in that pain can actually deepen your life.
Wow. That is so impressive how that comes together. You
Mhm.
must have done, because I know you're so in tune with research and doing so much research. I just can't imagine the amount of research you did for this book.
Yes, lots of research, and also research into like what doesn't exist, like what research isn't yet out there. There's a lot of really encouraging neuroscience that supports the idea that joy and hope actually inhibit fear. That's really, really powerful. We know that fear inhibits hope, right? We experience that sometimes on a daily basis. But if hope inhibits fear, then what else can we do with that? How can we capitalize on that to make our lives feel more balanced and whole? I think it's a really exciting time, because I think that, in the next 20 years, we're going to see a lot more research, hopefully, about some of the positive things in the brain, some of the adaptive techniques that we have available to us. And the more we know about those, the more we can help each other and ourselves out of these dark moments.
Well, that is extraordinary. I can't wait to hear more about that. Let's talk about hypervigilance and what it does as far as our potential for growth and connection.
Yeah, so hypervigilance, this is one of those things I think we're very quick to label something as adaptive or maladaptive. This is either good or bad. We want to put something very neatly into one bucket or the other. Hypervigilance, like many things, is an adaptation that is incredibly helpful. So if you're in a situation, let's say you're getting chased down the road, being hypervigilant about where things are that you might trip over is going to save your life potentially. So we don't want to get rid of hypervigilance. It's an adaptive mechanism. The problem is that any adaptive mechanism can over time become maladaptive. So something that was designed and intended and actually did protect you can become something that keeps you small or keeps you away from the good things in life. So I think the first step there is to understand that these adaptive things are helpful so we don't shame ourselves, because if we have shame, then it makes it even more hard to heal. And then to say, okay, what is my relationship with hypervigilance and what can I do to change that relationship so that I'm choosing to be hypervigilant when it's necessary, but then also kind of understand how to put it down when I am in a situation where I'm safe.
Well, how empowering is that? And one thing I want to touch on in your book, you talk about the fear of loss. So, how can we get beyond that and work on developing hope?
Yes, absolutely. I think that the fear of loss, again, this is an adaptive thing. This is something that sometimes I feel like I was put on this earth to learn how to grieve. I'm sure I'm not the only one that feels like that. And it is a scary thing. We are never more vulnerable than when we love another human being, because as soon as we do, we are vulnerable to the loss of that human being. And that can be in like a conflict or a breakup or also a death. And that is just terrible. It's tragic. It's heartbreaking. And there's nothing we can do about that. That's the piece we can't control. That's the uncertainty. But I think that sometimes we get tricked into thinking that that uncertainty means we should just disconnect, right? We've all had that moment where we think like, well, I'm just not going to love then because it's not worth it, right? If I'm going to be this scared all the time, then I'm just going to disconnect. But that's just not the way to live. And I think when we understand how to grieve and when we let all of the pain kind of come in waves as it does, then what we get to is that there is depth and love and hope actually even in the loss. I tell the story in the book. I actually had a kind of a breakdown in the middle of writing the book where I stopped believing in hope and joy because the external circumstances in my life were just so dark that I thought I can't possibly write a book for people about how to access joy because I completely lost access to it myself while I was writing it. Like, what are the odds? But then I took a couple of weeks off of the project and just thought, okay, I'm not going to send the advance back just yet. Let me wait and see. And what I noticed was that as long as I remained open to it, hope and joy kept finding me anyway. And it can be the tiniest hope. It doesn't have to be huge hope for your future. It can be hope for, the new recipe you want to try out at dinner. I remember after my father died, I would be kind of lying on the floor in my apartment, just sort of keening at the loss. This was so terrible and so sudden and so shocking. And invariably, every single time, there would be some tiny little thing that would sort of come knocking and disrupt the pain. Not because I was looking for it, but just because this is how the world works. And so I would be laying there and crying and thinking, this is the darkest thing that ever happened. And then someone's laughter would filter up through the window, or the light would shift and hit a vase in the window and just throw a rainbow across the floor. Or I would start to get hungry, and before I realized it, I was looking forward to dinner I was about to make, right? Like, and those are tiny things, and again, they're not there to counter the grief. Nothing can do that. But they balance it out so that we can survive. They are anchors.
It's almost like clouds having that silver lining.
Yeah. And if you think about the like physics of that, right? The cloud is huge, it's raining, it's causing all this upset. But if the silver lining is there, right? It's small, it doesn't counter the rain, but it's there too. And I think that was something that I realized in all of the things that have gone on in my own life. And I've also seen this with clients who are dealing with incredible loss and uncertainty and trauma, is that the joy, you might be in a dark cave. That may be true. You might be in like a howling abyss, but the light is there too, if you're willing to be open to it.
I really love how this book offers us hope to show up in life.
And they will come knocking anyway. So it's okay to lose hope. It's okay to feel like you can't access joy. I think we do so much harm when we go to war with our emotions instead of accepting them. If you're really in despair and you don't feel like hope is possible, it's okay. Your job, as I said before, is just to hold on. It will come back. Life will get better. It's just how it works.
So I'd like to touch on forgiveness. And I know this is a really big topic. A lot
Mhm.
of people, we can get to places where we can forgive others. Hey, great, that's awesome. And
Mhm.
sometimes that takes a while. What I hear people struggle with often is the ability to forgive themselves. So,
Mm.
what role does this play in our brain, especially for being able to come to this place of forgiveness?
Yeah, I think this is really connected to that guilt and shame piece because when we can't forgive ourselves, that's when we're steeping ourselves in shame, right? So it's not just that I did a bad thing or I made a mistake or I offended a friend and I have to go repair that so that I can stay in relationship with them. It's this belief that you are fundamentally broken or damaged or, not worthy of anything good, hope, joy, love, success, peace, any of that. And when it comes to forgiveness, I think also this is something that we don't talk about enough when it comes to like, I think we talk about forgiveness as this giant bucket thing, and we tell people they have to forgive themselves and they have to forgive other people, but we don't tell them how. And I think that there's a lot of work that gets done in understanding what you were doing when you're doing the thing that you can't forgive yourself for. So if we understand that we are always reaching for something adaptive, that is just how our biology works, then that means we don't have to shame ourselves anymore for what we reached for in desperation. And I think that that can do a lot of work towards if you can understand why you did something or why you are a certain way, then you can start to unpack that shame and recognize that it doesn't belong, that it can be redirected back into guilt, and then you can do something about it. Right? Again, if you're guilty of something, then you can repair. But that shame is just it's a lie. I say in the book that shame is just guilt metastasized, right? Like it's guilt that has gone so unchecked that it has grown into this fundamental belief. And I think that what that means is that we have to sort of snap back to the guilt and see, okay, what can I do to repair? What can I do to let myself off of the hook, right? And then become really, sort of refuse to let the shame try to define who you are.
So one of the things I really appreciate about this book is you not only share the science and what is going on, you give beautiful examples, but you also show a path for people in the how. Like, how do we get from here to there? And that's
Mhm.
such a big deal because often we do, we've got great books. They say, hey, feel more joy, feel more hope. And people, it seems like that's a bridge that is just not visible because they don't know how to do it. And I love your book because it does share with people how to make these adjustments, these shifts, even if they're small.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think that's so important. And I think that, again, some of the practices might feel like, oh, this is so like tiny little joys. That's really going to change my brain and that's going to change the way that I see the world. Yes, 100%. Yes. I've been doing a practice this year where I do a tiny little joy every single day on Instagram. And there's this huge community of people who are doing it every single day and people who are reporting, like, wow, I notice the good now. I didn't notice it before. And so I think giving people practices and also practices that are actually easy to fold into your everyday life is the best way to get that change happening because we can understand the cognitive framing of it, but if we can't put it into action, then it's ultimately not helpful.
So being part of that community and being involved in that practice, is that changing people's actual minds as they're doing this, looking for pieces of joy and hope within their lives?
It is because again, every moment that we spend sort of in the hope circuit, right, by imprinting joy in this way is a second that we spend where the fear circuit is offline. So if you're someone, for example, who's stuck in hypervigilance, this is giving you a 10 or 20 second, break every single day. The more you do that, the more your brain sees, hey, we don't actually need to stay in this hypervigilant state all the time. And I think the evidence is in the fact that people are seeing the world differently. They're saying things like, yeah, this was not a great week, but I was able to point out 7 things that were good. And so, okay, yes, the bad, yes, the darkness, but also, yes, the good, and yes, the light. And I think, again, when it comes to brain changes, this is not the sexiest thing ever, but we make real change in our brains by committing to practices that we can really do every single day and by rote. If you've learned a language, you know that it's just practice that makes it possible. You have to practice those vocabulary words every single day or close to it. And when you do that, you see that you suddenly have a bank of vocabulary that's from a different language, and that's pretty amazing.
Just those tiny steps every day that make such a difference. And
Exactly.
what would you suggest for our listeners to do to start developing more, just more joy and more happiness in their life?
So again, I can't recommend the Tiny Little Joys practice enough because it is so, so easy. And it's something that you can do once a day. You can commit to that. It takes 10 seconds. You can also, you can do it 3 times a day if you like. But I think the first step is really in understanding how to define joy. And again, joy is not this fluffy luxury that you don't have time for right now. It is a steely, resilient, gritty pillar of resilience. And we need those right now. And in fact, it is your duty to practice this because the more you can connect to joy in your life, the more calm and regulated you will be for everybody else in your life. So, for those people who feel guilty and feel like, I've been getting a lot of questions like, is it really okay to focus on joy right now? Yes. In fact, you have a responsibility to do that because it makes you available for the rest of your life.
Well, MaryCatherine, you are such an inspiration. Where can our listeners go to learn more about your books and, of course, the Joy Reset and to be part of your community?
Oh, thank you so much. The book is available anywhere that you buy books, and folks can find me on social media. My handle is always the same on TikTok and on Instagram. It's just mc.phd. And then my website is alchemycoaching.life.
Well, MaryCatherine, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the show with us here today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been lovely.
Well, thank you, MaryCatherine. It's been such an honor to spend this time with you and to talk about your new book, The Joy Reset: 6 Ways Trauma Steals Happiness and How to Win It Back. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I'd like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Mary Ann, where we make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Mary Ann is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Mary Ann will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmaryann.com for more information.